Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create the Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. I've often spoken about Assyria, usually when teaching Isaiah or giving an introduction to the prophets. The Assyrian Empire is an important piece of the history underlying the Old Testament. However, this means I've usually had quite a narrow focus. Reading Eckhart Fram's book, Assyria, The Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire, has brought a welcome expansion. It's surprisingly readable, and I found it a very enjoyable read. For the most part, it did not change the facts as I had known them before, but it certainly added depth. It put flesh on the mere bones of those facts. For one, the Assyrian kings who play a role in the Hebrew Bible had, not surprisingly, a life and personality beyond what we read in the Bible and what we need to understand what is written there. Something similar applies to Assyria itself. There is much more to it than the essentials for understanding the biblical narrative. So let's dive in for a taste and start with the early days of Assyria. By the time the Assyrians began to impinge on the biblical story, they already had a long history behind them. It all began with Ashur shortly before 2000 BC. Ashur was both a city and its god. Or perhaps one should say, Ashur was both a god and its city. That's probably how the Assyrians would have put it. Originally, it was a city of merchants, not of conquerors. A city-state, no more. It would be a long road to empire with many setbacks. Though it began as a city of traders, Ashur would change dramatically over the coming centuries. And eventually, as in the case of Rome, in the words of Frahm, Assyria became a war-prone, multi-ethnic conqueror state, organized into many provinces, with resources moving from all over the empire to its center. Assyria became an empire. It is common to distinguish three phases in the history of Assyria. The Old Assyrian period, about 2000 down to 1700 BC, a transition period that I left out here. The Middle Assyrian period, beginning in 1363, lasting until 935 BC, and the Neo-Assyrian period, 935 down to 612 BC. Each period came with far-reaching change that gradually transformed Assyria into a great power. The first phase, the Old Assyrian period, is characterized by the trading network of the city of Ashur. Its merchants were active in substantial parts of Anatolia and Mesopotamia. There followed a long period of transition about which we are less well informed. During this time, Ashur became a monarchy and a larger territory, or we could say country, Assyria, but it not yet morphed into an empire. It did become more aggressive and war-prone. Then the Middle Assyrian period, beginning in 1363 BC. From this time onward, Assyria felt led by a divine mandate to expand its land. To do so was not merely expedient, it was a religious duty, a God-given mission. It's during this time that the Assyrian kings for the first time began to use titles like King of the World. We also read about the first deportation, a practice that would become a defining feature of the empire to come. The second half of the Middle Assyrian period was a time of widespread crisis in the eastern Mediterranean, the so-called Late Bronze Age collapse, which also impacted Assyria. However, the kingdom survived, and in 935 BC, the Neo-Assyrian period began. Frahm describes it as a long campaign of subjugation, destruction, annexation, unsparing and violent. Or, in the words of King Esarhaddon, before me cities, behind me ruins. The Neo-Assyrian period lasted until the fall of the empire, approximately 612 BC, if we take the fall of Nineveh. This is the Assyria we know. Frahm speaking here again, it was only now, in the 9th century BC, that many of the features that would define Assyria for the rest of its history came into being. Royal cities so massive that they dwarfed all previous urban foundations, monumental art in the form of bull and lion colossi, and reliefs lining the walls of palaces, and a relentless cycle of annual military campaigns. These reliefs vividly illustrate Assyrian aggression and cruelty. In the king's own words, this is Ashur-nasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BC. I am king, I am lord, I am praiseworthy, I am exalted, I am important, I am magnificent, I am foremost, I am a hero, I am a warrior, I am a lion, and I am a man. I captured many troops alive. From some I cut off their arms and hands, from others I cut off their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I hung their heads on trees around the city. I burned many of their adolescent boys and girls. I razed, destroyed, burned, and consumed the city. As for these reliefs, I had always thought that the Assyrians decorated their palaces in this way to intimidate. Representatives of vassal states had to bring their tribute in person into the palace. They would witness the might of Assyria and the consequences of rebellion. Well, this might well be true, but Frahm poses a different purpose. These inscriptions and illustrations were meant to inculcate the values and ideology of the empire, primarily to indoctrinate succeeding generations of Assyrian leaders, the king's sons and the ruling elite of the empire. It was only in the Neo-Assyrian period that Assyrian influence directly impacted Israel. First armed contact took place during the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. Later, King Jehu of Israel, 2 Kings chapter 9 and 10, paid tribute to Assyria, as famously portrayed on this object, the so-called Black Obelisk, on display in the British Museum in London. The next slide shows a detail from this obelisk. And here we see King Jehu kneeling down, completely prostrate before the king of Assyria. A time of instability in Assyria brought respite, leading to a second golden age for Israel and Judah, actually, under Uzziah and Jeroboam II, described in 2 Kings 14 and 15. However, once Tiglath-Pileser III took the throne in 745 BC, Assyrian expansion continued relentlessly. Well, except for certain events in the year 701 BC, when then King Sennacherib, whose rule started in 705, lost an entire army in Judah. At least that's remembered in the Bible. Frahm considers this account historical fiction. Now, did this indeed make Assyria the world's first empire, as Frahm argues? What about Nimrod's kingdom in Genesis 10, or the Egyptians and the Hittites? It all depends, of course, on your definition. If it is essential to an empire to be a multi-ethnic conglomerate of territories, some of which are ruled by local elites from those territories, the way the Herod dynasty did for the Romans, then the thesis makes sense. Assyria would have been the first empire. Now, whether we agree or not, Assyria certainly took things to a new level, and others, beginning with Babylon, would follow in its footsteps. But at the same time, The Assyrian Empire exemplifies a human drive that has been in evidence from very early on. Again, think Nimrod, the desire to control and exploit others. Here is an interesting tidbit of information, one among many in Fram's book, by the way, that perhaps helps explain Isaiah chapter 14, a remarkable description of the Babylonian king descending into the realm of the dead. It is a sarcastic lamentation, a funeral song ridiculing the demise of the proud king. In the words of Isaiah, verse 16b, the man who made the earth tremble, who made the world like a desert. But now, verse 12, he is fallen from heaven and cut down to the ground. Nothing suggests, by the way, that this is about Satan, much less about his original fall from grace. It's the description of a human and his demise, his final fall. In verse 18 and following, the king is described as cast out away from his grave. No tomb or burial for him. But which king of Babylon can this be? Beginning with Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, there were not many, and none of those few suffered such a fate. However, here's what happened to Sargon II, who reigned from 722 to 705 BC. Sargon had been a strong and effective ruler, successfully conducting numerous campaigns, and in 705 he took his army on yet another campaign in today's Turkey and did not return. Worse, his body could not be recovered, so the king could not be properly buried. Now, it's hard for us to understand the horror this instilled at home. From an Assyrian perspective, proper burial was crucial, and not only to honor the king. There was a very real risk that the dead would come back to haunt the living if they were not properly banished. They could strike properly buried. They would strike with sickness, misery, or death. This was scary, horror. The unburied dead, so it was believed, who had no one to provide food for them, were doomed to roam around, starving and in search of any scrap of food. Now, what we need to recognize is that at this time, during the lifetime of Isaiah, Babylon was part of the Assyrian Empire. In fact, starting in 729 BC, Tiglath-Pileser had called himself, in addition to his Assyrian titles, King of Babylon. Likewise, Sargon could truthfully be considered King of Babylon. And so, the dismal end of Sargon may be the inspiration for Isaiah's sarcastic lament, a taunt that had application to later Babylonian kings and indeed to tyrants of all times. They may not literally suffer Sargon's fate, but their final journey and destination won't be pretty either. When it came, the end of the Assyrian Empire came shockingly fast. From its pinnacle in the mid-650s to the fall of Nineveh, 612 BC, took a mere 4 decades. Even as late as 615 BC, so Frahm, quote, Assyria's political and military situation was challenging, but not yet desperate. 5 years later, there was nothing left. Frahm devotes all of chapter 14 to an analysis of Assyria's collapse. The causes are multiple, too complex to cover here. But one reason was a sequence of weak kings following the last towering figure on the throne, Ashurbanipal, 669 to 631 BC. You see him here hunting wild donkeys. And in fact, Frahm concludes that Ashurbanipal himself was a lot less towering than his carefully crafted public image wants us to believe. He was a poor military leader, an overrated hunter, and a mediocre scholar, With his sadistic propensities, he resembled more a Nero than a philosopher-emperor like Marcus Aurelius or Akbar. When, later in his reign, Assyria's political and economic situation deteriorated, Ashurbanipal must have realized that many members of the Assyrian elite had begun to see his rule as a failure. He withdrew more and more from public life, relied increasingly on eunuchs, and neglected, it would seem, his governing duties. And so, whatever its exact explanation, Assyria's fall illustrates a universal truth. Tyrants and empires don't last. The final chapters of the book I found less convincing, though. Frahm puts in an effort to show that the Assyrian Empire did not disappear, but in some ways continued after its collapse. Here, by the way, you are looking at the site of Nineveh today. And to be sure, certain Assyrian ideas and practices continued, as did some of their communities. The city of Ashur was partially rebuilt. Nineveh was not. But that's hardly the same as the continuation of an empire. Just as Europe and the United States are not the continuation of the Roman Empire, even though they have adopted quite a few of its ideas and institutions. I'm also unconvinced by Fram's attempt to make Assyria not appear all bad and no good. Hey, that other empires did horrible things too hardly exonerates the Assyrians. And then the first half of chapter 17 looks at the representation of the Assyrians in the Bible. Now, this section I found the low point in the book. It feels tacked on, first of all, perhaps to satisfy anticipated popular demand. The obvious question, what about the Bible? Well, it's far too brief to do justice to the subject, and it's dominated by a negative stand on the Bible's historical value. To Frahm, it offers merely a distorted image of Assyria. But the rest of the book is a great read.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your